Imagine an instrument that, like, practically plays itself.
Yeah, it sounds like science fiction, honestly.
Right. You just drag a bow across a single string to play a simple melody, but hidden right beneath that top layer is this shadowy chorus of other strings.
And you never even touch them.
Exactly, and you never touch them, yet they vibrate entirely on their own, and it creates this continuous, really eerie, metallic drone that just hangs in the air long after you stop playing.
It's a very specific, very haunting sound.
It really is. And, this isn't a ghost story, and it isn't some modern electronic synthesizer trick. It's an actual piece of acoustic technology that was developed centuries ago in the frozen, isolated reaches of Northern Europe. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
And to you, the learner, listening right now, we are heading straight into those dark woods today. We're looking at a truly remarkable piece of source material from Monumental Movement Records, or MMR. It's this exhaustive column unpacking the dark mythological nature of Nordic folk music.
It's such a deeply complex subject.
Yeah.
And the source material does an incredible job of looking past the superficial elements. When we talk about Nordic folk music, we are referring to those ancient traditional soundscapes echoing out of Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Iceland.
Right.
And as the MMR column meticulously documents, this genre actively defies what most people consider, quote-unquote folk music to be.
Okay, let's unpack this, because usually when I hear folk music, my brain instantly goes to acoustic warmth.
Sure, yeah, a gathering around a campfire.
Exactly, communal singing, songs about a long journey, or returning home to your loved ones. But the music MMR analyzes is fundamentally built on minor keys.
Oh, absolutely. It
Yeah.
treats tension and absolute silence as lead instruments.
Yes, and the lyrics completely avoid those standard tropes of heartbreak or romance. Instead, they just dive straight into ancient curses, blood-curdling betrayal, and hostile entities lurking just out of sight in the fog.
It's incredibly bleak.
It is. So why is this music so fundamentally, relentlessly dark? And more importantly, what can a sound born centuries ago in the freezing taiga teach you and me about how human beings process fear, the brutality of the natural world, and the concept of an inevitable end?
Well, to even begin answering that, the MMR column argues we have to look at the macro-level architecture of the culture that created it.
A big picture.
Right. You cannot understand the audio without understanding the cosmic blueprint. We have to start with Norse mythology. But we have to look at it not as a collection of superhero stories, the way pop culture shows it. We have to look at it as an existential framework.
Because if you're building a house, the foundation dictates the shape.
Precisely.
And the foundation of this particular cultural house is built on a blueprint of absolute, unavoidable doom.
What's fascinating here is that Norse mythology is one of the very few ancient belief systems that is inherently programmed with its own ultimate destruction.
Right, the concept of Ragnarok.
Yes, Ragnarok. If you look at other global mythologies, the gods generally represent an eternal, unshakable order. They're these immortal, untouchable entities sitting way up above the clouds.
Like they're completely insulated from human problems.
Exactly.
Mm.
And their existence is kind of a promise to humanity that no matter how chaotic things get down on Earth, the universe itself is fundamentally stable. It's governed by a benevolent logic.
But the Nordic pantheon operates on completely different rules. Their gods are definitely not immortal overseers.
Far from it. In the Norse pantheon, the gods age. They bleed. They make these catastrophic, morally questionable mistakes. And crucially, they die.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The source text highlights two perfect examples of this harsh reality. First, you have Odin, the All-Father. In order to gain knowledge from Mimir's well, he literally has to tear out his own eye.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Knowledge and wisdom in this universe, they aren't freely given through divine grace. They are brutally transactional and bought with actual physical pain.
Wow. And then there's Loki.
Right, Loki. He sits among the gods, but serves as this fundamental agent of destruction. He's the internal catalyst that guarantees the end of the world.
It's remarkably similar to playing a video game where, from the very moment you look at the title screen, that it is completely impossible to win.
That's a great way to put it.
Like the game over screen is just hard-coded into the software. You cannot beat the game. But the entire philosophy, the whole point of picking up the controller isn't to win. It's about how bravely and honorably you play the game before that inevitable end arrives.
That is precisely the psychological shift the MMR article is talking about. When you realize that the universe itself is built to die, It entirely resets your psychological baseline.
It has to.
Right. It creates a worldview and, by extension, a musical landscape entirely focused on fate rather than hope.
Let's pause on that. Fate rather than hope. That is a massive distinction.
It changes everything about how art is created. When a culture does not have the promise of an eternal peaceful order, they do not write music that prays for miraculous divine salvation.
Because what's the point?
Exactly. They don't write songs asking to be saved. Instead, they write music that reflects a profound, stoic acceptance of reality. The darkness in the music isn't pessimism or depression, it's an intellectual acceptance of the inevitable.
So that covers the macro-level cosmic doom, but I want to explore how that macro belief shrinks down into micro-anxieties.
Okay, yeah.
Because everyday people living in the year 900 or 1200, they weren't just sitting around all day contemplating the fiery collapse of the universe. They had to survive the winter. We need to transition from the realm of the dying gods down into the literal forests, lakes, and swamps right outside their doors.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the harshness of the cosmos was perfectly mirrored by the harshness of the geography.
The environment itself was trying to kill them.
Constantly. The Nordic landscape was unforgiving. It was freezing, locked in darkness for much of the year, and incredibly isolated. This is where the local terrestrial spirits come into play. The source details how deep-rooted pagan folklore survived for centuries through entities that personified the actual dangers of nature.
The MMR article lists a few of these local spirits, and honestly, they are terrifying. In Sweden, you have the Skogsro. In Norway, the Huldra. In Finland, the Metsenväki. Can you break down what an encounter with one of these entities actually looked like in the folklore?
Sure. So these are deeply tied to the deep forest and the uncivilized wild. The Huldra, for example, is typically described as an overwhelmingly beautiful, alluring female spirit.
Okay.
She might approach a solitary hunter or a charcoal burner working deep in the woods. From the front, she is captivating. She often offers incredible blessings, maybe unexplainable wealth, perfect luck in hunting, or supernatural musical ability.
But there is always a catch.
Always. If you look closely, she has the tail of a cow.
Wait, really?
Yes, or her back is completely hollow like a rotting tree trunk.
Oh, that is so unsettling.
It's meant to be. If a human gets too close, if they fall for the illusion and cross the boundary between the civilized human world and the wild domain she controls, she will completely destroy them. The folk songs are littered with highly specific tales of people venturing into the woods, meeting these entities, and ending up either dead, forever lost, or descending into absolute incurable madness.
Wait, I'm struggling with the function of these stories. Were these just like spooky campfire tales designed to scare children so they wouldn't wander off into a freezing swamp? Or is the source arguing there was a deeper structural purpose to embedding these monsters into the music?
They were much more than just fables to keep children in line. The MMR column argues they functioned as practical, life-saving manuals.
Manuals.
Yeah, you have to remember the absolute precarity of life in that landscape. A dense, uncharted forest or a treacherous marsh will kill you if you are arrogant, careless, or easily distracted.
So the monsters in the lyrics were basically a psychological survival mechanism?
Precisely. It was ancient wisdom encoded right into melody. The spirits represent the brutal duality of nature itself.
Beautiful but deadly.
Exactly. The forest is beautiful, and it provides the wood and meat you need to survive. But it is completely and utterly indifferent to your existence. If you disrespect its boundaries, it will consume you. The music was a stark, constant reminder to respect the wild.
That makes perfect sense as a survival strategy. But if the folklore was a survival manual, let's look at how that manual was actually read aloud. Because the source transitions into the medieval ballads, which really started cementing their lyrical form around the year 1300.
Right, the medieval period.
And the lyrical content is intensely explicit.
Oh, the medieval ballads pull no punches whatsoever.
It reads like the darkest true crime story you can imagine. We are talking about songs detailing brutal sibling murder, vicious lovers' betrayals, ghosts physically returning from the grave to harass the living, and mothers committing infanticide.
It's very heavy material.
Extremely. But here's where I need you to clarify something, because the delivery of these songs baffles me. If you are singing a song about your brother bearing an axe in your back, wouldn't you want to sing it with massive emotion?
You would think so?
Yeah, to scare people into behaving, to impart the horror of the act.
You would naturally expect dramatic swells, screaming or weeping, yes. But the defining characteristic of the Nordic medieval ballad is extreme restraint.
They sing it like they are reading a grocery list.
Yeah, basically.
I need milk, I need bread, and then I was murdered in the snow. It is entirely flat and factual. Why strip the emotion out of such heavy, horrific material? Was it just a lack of musical training?
Not at all. It was a highly intentional choice, and it serves a very specific psychological function. By removing the emotional interpretation from the singer, the song forces the listener to process the horror entirely on their own.
Ah, I see.
The singer is just a neutral vessel for the facts, but more importantly, it reveals their overarching perspective on mortality. In that era, and under that belief system, death was not sensationalized.
Because of that fate over hope worldview we talked about earlier. If the universe is doomed, your individual death isn't a cosmic tragedy.
Exactly. Sensationalizing death implies that it is an unnatural event, an aberration that shatters the universe. But the Nordic view saw death, even violent death, as a mundane, everyday extension of existence.
That's a Tuesday.
Yeah, it was just a fact of life, as natural as the winter snow. The stoicism in the vocal delivery of these ballads perfectly mirrors the stoicism required to simply survive their daily reality.
Okay, I want to pivot from the vocals to the actual soundscape because the source makes a fascinating point here. Let's say you don't speak a word of Swedish or Norwegian or Finnish.
In no language context.
Exactly. You strip away the bloody lyrics, you take away the tales of the forest monsters. Even as a pure instrumental, this music sounds deeply unsettling. And MMR explains that the darkness is actually physically engineered into the architecture of the instruments themselves.
The acoustic engineering of Nordic folk instruments is truly unique, and it fundamentally dictates the mood of the entire genre. The article highlights three specific traditional instruments: the Hardingfell, which is the Hardanger fiddle from Norway, the Nyckelharpa from Sweden, and the Kantele from Finland.
I brought up the Hardanger fiddle at the very beginning of the deep dive, the instrument that practically plays itself. The source talks about sympathetic strings and open strings. Can you break down the actual physics of what is happening and, more importantly, why it makes the music sound so haunting?
Of course. Let's look at the Hardanger fiddle. From the top, it looks somewhat like a standard violin. You have a set of primary strings that the musician actively bows to play a melody,
Okay.
but routed through the bridge, underneath the fingerboard, is a second set of strings called sympathetic strings. The musician never touches them. Not once. However, when the primary strings are bowed, the acoustic vibrations travel down through the physical wood of the instrument. Those vibrations match the resonant frequencies of the hidden strings, causing them to vibrate and ring out entirely on their own.
So you play one note, but the instrument generates a constant, shadowy overtone beneath it.
Exactly. And what this does mechanically is create a continuous drone note.
Right, a drone.
A drone is a harmonic or monophonic effect where a note or chord is continuously sounded throughout most or all of a piece. And because of the tuning, it creates a lot of natural dissonance.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Why does that specific dissonance make human beings feel anxious or suspended? Like, what is happening in our brains when we hear those droning, dissonant notes?
It comes down to how human ears have been conditioned to process acoustic resolution. In standard Western music, our brains are biologically and culturally wired to crave something called the tonic chord, the home chord.
The comfortable one.
Yes. A piece of music will introduce a dominant chord, which creates acoustic tension. Our brains recognize the tension, and we eagerly wait for the music to resolve back to the tonic chord. When it does, our brain releases a tiny hit of dopamine. It feels satisfying, feels safe.
But the Nordic drone actively denies you that dopamine hit.
Precisely. The continuous drone strings on a Nyckelharpa or a Hardanger fiddle actively block that resolution. The tension is introduced, but the dissonant drone prevents the chord progression from ever truly feeling resolved.
So you're just stuck there.
You really are. It keeps your acoustic perception in a state of permanent suspension. Your brain is waiting for the tension to break, but the instrument refuses to let it.
It is holding your cortisol levels in suspension. The physical structure of the wood and the strings is literally enforcing that mythological darkness before a single word of a murder ballad is even sung. You are physically trapped in the tension of the soundscape.
The acoustic environment refuses to give you easy comfort. It demands that you sit in the unresolved shadow, which ties directly back to their existential framework we discussed. You cannot pray for resolution. You must simply endure the tension.
Which is brilliant, but this brings up a major historical contradiction that I want to explore. We're talking about a pagan, fate-driven worldview from the Viking Age. We're talking about unresolving acoustic tension and murder ballads from the 1300s.
Right.
But the region didn't stay isolated forever. They went through massive cultural and religious shifts. How on earth did this hyper-specific dark music survive all the way to the present day?
The timeline detailed by MMR is honestly a masterclass in cultural endurance. The most significant threat to this worldview was the arrival of Christianity, which began sweeping through the Nordic regions around the year 1100.
And historically, when a new dominant monotheistic religion rolls into a region, the old pagan myths get entirely wiped out or violently suppressed.
The religious authorities certainly attempted to eradicate it. The old gods and the local forest spirits were officially condemned as heresy or dismissed as ignorant superstitions.
But it didn't work.
No, because human psychology doesn't work like a light switch. A population doesn't just instantly forget its foundational stories and survival manuals because a new authority arrives. Instead of eradication, a complex synthesis occurred.
The source calls this the double darkness. How did those two completely opposing systems merge?
Think of it like painting over a dark, heavily textured wall with a single thin coat of white paint.
Okay, I can picture that.
The new color is technically on the surface, but the dark texture bleeds entirely through. Christian concepts like the devil, the literal existence of hell, and the heavy spiritual burden of sin began to merge with the pre-existing folklore about dangerous forest spirits and inescapable fate.
So you take the physical terror of the harsh natural world, the swamp that will swallow you, and you layer it with the new spiritual terror of eternal damnation.
Exactly, it compounded the darkness. But uniquely, the Nordic tradition maintained its ambiguous boundaries. Even as Christian concepts bled into the songs, these supernatural entities were rarely painted as purely 100% evil in the way modern theology might portray a demon.
Because nature itself isn't evil. A blizzard isn't malicious, it's just a blizzard. The ambiguity had to stay intact because the actual physical environment hadn't changed.
Correct. The synthesis survived for centuries until we hit the 1800s, which brought a massive nationalist movement sweeping through Europe.
Oh, right. The Romantic era.
Yeah. Urban intellectuals started traveling into the rural Nordic countryside to collect these old, strange songs.
Yeah.
They framed them as vital cultural heritage. But in doing so, they attempted to sanitize the darkness.
Of course they did.
They tried to organize the music, transpose it into standard Western notation, make it more literary, and ultimately make it less threatening for polite society.
They tried to domesticate the music. But you cannot domesticate acoustic dissonance forever. Which leads us to the final evolution outlined in the source. The 1970s folk revival, which birthed what we now call modern dark folk, neo-folk, and Nordic ambient music.
A huge resurgence.
And the MMR article makes a crucial point here about what modern artists are actually doing with this ancient sound.
Yes. When modern musicians began intentionally foregrounding that ancient, unresolving darkness again, they weren't engaging in historical reenactment. They weren't putting on Viking tunics to pretend it was the year 800.
It wasn't cosplay.
No, not at all. They were recognizing that the acoustic architecture of the past was perfectly suited to process the anxieties of the present.
The source notes they are translating the darkness for a modern ear. How exactly are they doing that mechanically? What does modern neofolk do to the ancient drone?
They amplify the dissonance. Modern artists take the traditional sympathetic strings of the nyckelharpa or the Hardanger fiddle, and they layer them with modern audio technology.
Like synthesizers.
Exactly. They add heavy electronic ambient noise. They drop the tempo to an agonizingly slow crawl. They inject massive rumbling sub-bass frequencies that you literally feel in your chest. They take the acoustic tension that prevented the dopamine release in the 1300s, and they weaponize it using modern subwoofers and synths.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, today? Why are modern audiences actively seeking out music that is designed to make them feel unresolved tension? You, listening to this, are not fighting off a forest spirit in a frozen swamp.
Most likely not.
You are probably commuting to work or sitting at a desk or doing the laundry. Why should you care about the acoustic dissonance of a Norwegian fiddle or the stoicism of a medieval murder ballad?
Well, this raises an important question about why we consume art in the first place. The dark mythological nature of Nordic folk isn't about being edgy. It isn't about wallowing in tragedy or glorifying historical violence.
So what is it doing?
The MMR source concludes that this music is actually a highly developed, sophisticated knowledge system. It was engineered by generations of people to help human beings look directly at the terrifying indifference of nature, at the reality of death, at the passing of time, and at the inevitability of fate without blinking.
Without blinking. That is the core of it. And I think the reason this ancient acoustic formula resonates so deeply with millions of people right now is because we are living in our own age of profound, inescapable uncertainty.
We really are.
We might not fear the literal arrival of Ragnarok, but we are surrounded by massive systemic dread. We face unprecedented ecological shifts, intense societal instability, and a 24-hour cycle of terrible, unresolvable news.
And how does modern pop culture tell us to handle that dread? It tells us to look away. It tells us to seek out easy acoustic resolution. It encourages us to consume content that distracts us, numbs us, and falsely promises that everything will be neatly resolved in the end.
But Nordic folk music offers a completely different ancient template. It offers a sonic framework for how to live with the dark. It teaches you how to sit in the unresolved, dissonant tension of life, rather than expending all your energy trying to falsely deny that the tension exists.
That's a much healthier approach, honestly.
It reminds you that the game might be unwinnable, but you can still play it with immense dignity.
It is the musical embodiment of psychological resilience. By deeply acknowledging the shadows and allowing the dissonance to ring out, you are no longer controlled by the fear of it.
You learn to navigate the dark woods, rather than pretending you are still sitting safely by the campfire.
A profound lesson from a truly remarkable source.
It truly is. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the architecture of Nordic folk, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over long after we sign off. If this ancient music was a highly engineered sonic survival manual for facing the harsh, unpredictable realities of their era, look at the music in your own daily playlist right now. What exactly is it preparing you to survive today?